Good evening. Welcome to all of you. I'm Pastor Tim Westermeyer, one of the pastors at St. Philip the Deacon Lutheran Church here in Plymouth. And on behalf of St. Philip the Deacon and Mount Olivet, which jointly present this lecture series, it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you here tonight. Just a quick word about the flow of the evening. After we hear from our speaker, there will be a chance for you to ask some questions directly of him through an open microphone. So I encourage you, as you're listening to his talk, to be thinking about things you'd like to ask him. Those discussions are often very interesting and informative, so please do feel free to ask questions when we get to that point. The Faith and Life lecture series, for those of you who have been here before, are opportunities for us to gather and hear people talk about how Christian faith is connected to different dimensions of everyday life. For a number of years now, we've been thinking about finding a way to have a speaker come in and talk about some dimension of the military, and we've thought about different options, and we settled on tonight's speaker. And at this point in my short introduction, I would actually introduce him. However, I'm going to turn the mic over tonight to a friend of his, someone who is a cadet at West Point under him, and a friend of the series as well. Steve Carter retired from the Army Reserves as a colonel. And Steve, if you'd like to introduce our speaker, please welcome him.
So Tim asked me to do this, so I have about 15, 20 minutes. And So I first met Chaplain Dick Camp as a freshman at West Point. That first year is known affectionately the first summer as Beast Barracks. And the upperclassmen have a propensity to develop your character about an inch from your face. And so the first time I met Chaplain Camp was he would have church services on Wednesday evening out on a place called Trophy Point. Beautiful place overlooking West Point and the Hudson River. And the best thing was he wasn't yelling at us. And he was giving us cookies. So there was all kinds of enticement to be there. I also saw him riding a motorcycle around the campus. And I said, wait a minute, chaplains can't be cool, can they? And he was and still is. And so that was a role model for me. He led the Fellowship of Christian Athletes at West Point. I played football there, and so Dick would be our mentor on Friday nights before the games. We play on Saturday. And he'd give us some spiritual encouragement and devotions. And we would need those because we were playing teams like Penn State, Notre Dame, Baylor, Pittsburgh, North Carolina, Stanford. As an offensive tackle, I got to block Mike Singletary, Lawrence Taylor. And boy, did I make them look good. So I needed Chaplain Camp's help. Dick's lovely wife, Regine, is here tonight. And in addition to raising their own 3 kids, she's the virtual mother to hundreds of cadets who she was involved with over the 22 plus years they were at West Point. And speaking of wives, after I graduated from West Point, went off and did some time in the Army, and then went back and served on the staff and faculty, Dick married my wife, Amanda, and me. And I was an old guy when I got married, and so I was still a little nervous about this marriage thing. And I remember sitting there before the ceremony, he pulled out under his robe advertising for Pepsi at the time in the early 90s. He said, "You got the right one, baby." So he said, "Steve, you got the right one, baby." He was right. More recently, I served with him on the Christian ministry in the national parks, where he was the executive director, and he dynamically and passionately led that ministry and has recently retired from that. He's worked with top world leaders, presidents, generals, Coach K, Coach Krzyzewski, who's now at Duke, was at Army when we were there, close friend of Dick's. And he's personally influenced and led thousands of individuals, both religiously and as a mentor, leading them to Christ and leading them in life. You can read in your pamphlet other things, specifics about Dick, but one thing that's not in there, a couple things are not in there. He was recruited by a coach at West Point named Vince Lombardi and decided not to go. He went to Wheaton College in Illinois and was an All-American fullback there. So he was a star athlete as a young guy. And you won't believe it when you see him, but he's over 70 years old now. And he's still one of the fastest Americans. He runs in the Masters track meets, and he was number 3 in the country as recently as last spring in the 200-meter dash. So he can chase you down if you say anything bad. Anyway, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce a leader, a coach, a mentor, a pastor, and most importantly, a friend, Chaplain Dick Camp.
I just want to see if you can react under pressure.
In the pre-dawn hours of March 4th, 2002, an Army Chinook helicopter, now a Chinook is as big as a school bus with two big propellers on top. An Army Chinook helicopter was maneuvering to land on a snow-covered mountain in eastern Afghanistan. Aboard was a platoon of Army Rangers, elite Army Rangers, sent to rescue a colleague, a downed Navy SEAL. Now, a SEAL is like an Army Ranger, only in the Navy. He had fallen out of a helicopter in enemy territory just 2 hours before. Unknown to the Rangers, they were heading for a deadly ambush by a well-armed cadre of Afghanistan Taliban Al-Qaeda fighters. This army assault was led by Captain Nate Self, a 2008 graduate of the United States Military Academy. And the next 15 hours of battle would be the defining moments in Captain Self's Army career. Before the helicopter even touched this snow-covered 10,000-foot peak, it was hit severely damaged by a rocket-propelled grenade. The helicopter falls with a queasy rush. In an instant, nearly 50,000 pounds of rubber, steel, and human flesh crash to the snow-covered earth. Captain Self later recalled that the night before this mission, he and a few other Rangers were having a Bible study. And the theme of that Bible study was Psalm 121. I lift mine eyes to the mountains. From whence comes my help? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He said, I learned that from my chaplain back at West Point. In those fearful pre-dawn moments, those thoughts rushed back to Captain Self's mind and experience. In those incredibly tense hours, Captain Self lost 7 men in the battle. Several others were wounded, including the captain himself. For his leadership in the battle, he earned the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart. His story was highlighted in the media, and as a result of his actions in Afghanistan, he was the guest of President Bush at the 2003 inaugural State of the Union speech. He sat up with Mrs. Bush in the balcony. His book, Two Wars, is an inspiring account of that battle and also the battle in his mind when he left combat to go back home. Nate represents hundreds of cadets with whom I had the privilege to work, who are now in leadership in all echelons of the Army. For more than 22 years, it was my great pleasure to be involved in the leadership at this prestigious, we might call it the nation's predominant leadership training institution. For 22 classes of cadets, it was my duty to stand before them and say, lift up your eyes to the hills. Where does your help come from? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. I sometimes wake up and wonder how I got to West Point. Well, is this a dream, or did it really happen? There's an old saying back in Maine. You can't get there from here. You have to go someplace else first. For me, this journey began in the 4th grade. Near the end of World War II, my father went into the Navy as a chaplain and was transferred over to the Marine Corps. Since we lived in a church parsonage, we had to move out to allow the interim minister to move in. So we moved with my grandparents in a community not too far away. One Saturday afternoon, Mother called me in to take a bath and put on my pajamas. As a restless 10-year-old, I turned on the radio and found a football game between an Army team and Cornell. I became enamored with both the game of football and the Army team and their exploits. I made it a point to find that place on the dial, and each subsequent Saturday I listened to Army. I became a fan. The next year, pictures all over my room of the Army team and the Army players. I was hooked. Remember, too, that in 1945 and 46, Army had the best team in the United States. Now I'm beginning to hear the distant echoes of duty, honor, country. Dad came back from the service. We moved back to the church. And I was again with two wonderful role models. Dad was a pastor, a leader in our community. Mother was a wonderful mother to her 5 children, of which I was the oldest. Their guidance to me was, do what's right, don't disappoint the Lord, don't disappoint your parents. Wow. Their love and their encouragement made these guidelines help me through high school, where I was a leader in sports, a leader on campus. It enabled me to stay faithful to the Lord that I was getting to know pretty well as a high schooler. In my senior year, we won the state championship in New Jersey, and I was privileged to be captain. One of the recruiters came, and I was called out of class. And this recruiter was from the United States Military Academy at West Point. I went in wide-eyed, and he talked about football, duty, honor, country. When I left, my head coach said, "Do you know who that was?" And I said, "No, he's from West Point. Some Italian name." He said, "Well, that was Vince Lombardi." I didn't know anything about Vince Lombardi then, but I sure appreciate those moments in retrospect. I attended Wheaton College, a small liberal arts college out in Illinois, and I was thrilled to find that all I had looked for in a college: a good education, an opportunity to grow in my relationship with God and with His Son Jesus, and to play sports in a college that had great athletic teams. That combo really intrigued me. Little did I know that my experiences there were preparing me for something down the road which would lead me to West Point. It was also at Wheaton that I met the woman of my dreams, with whom I've been a partner for 51 years. Both college and then seminary impressed my attentiveness to leadership and to faith. Strong role models helped shape my values and worldview, providing lessons that would be invaluable in my West Point experience. Our first church assignment was a little Baptist church in New Hampshire. I learned that leadership meant getting to know your people. And so we entertained them in our home, and I visited them in the workplace. I learned to spend quality time with the church leaders, whether it was meeting them for coffee or helping a farmer milk the cows when he was sick. It was there I played quarterback for New Hampshire's only semi-pro football team on Saturday night. And that experience took me out of the stereotypical role of a Baptist minister. It opened huge opportunities for ministry. After 4 years, we moved from this poverty pocket to an elite Boston suburb. 5 years there, then back to the seminary as the dean of students. But all the time, having the opportunity to work with young people, to create a desire for God, and to instill leadership in their early years. Does it get any better than this? No. Unless you get a call from West Point asking if you might be interested in coming as a chaplain. It would be a civilian position, an assistant chaplain working under the head chaplain at West Point. Here was an awesome opportunity. I was strong. I wanted to serve God. I'd only had 2 years of ROTC. That was my whole military experience. But I was ready for the challenge. And I can't begin to tell you all the experiences as the assistant chaplain and then for 17 years as the senior chaplain. But my purpose tonight is to examine with you how West Point inspires, educates, and trains young men and women to be leaders of character. And I hope that in this exploration, you too will be inspired to deepen your faith and to increase your influence in the world. Listen to the mission statement of the United States Military Academy: to educate, train, and inspire the Corps of Cadets so that each graduate is a commissioned leader of character, committed to the values of duty, honor, country, and prepared for a career of professional excellence and service to the nation as an officer in the United States Army. That's a lot. In 1962, General Douglas MacArthur, now an old man, came shuffled to West Point to receive the Thayer Award, a very prestigious award, and to address the Corps of Cadets in recognition of his award. In his reception speech, MacArthur gave the Corps of Cadets and West Point a treasure far greater than the medal that he received. Imagine 4,000 cadets in this huge mess hall, first bored or curious as to what the old general would have to say, and then in hushed silence, and finally in awe at his remarks. Here are a few excerpts from his speech. Duty, honor, country. These three hallowed words reverently dictate what you ought to be, what you want to be, what you will be. They are your rallying points to build courage when courage seems to fail, to regain faith when there seems to be little cause for faith, to create hope when hope seems forlorn. Unhappily, I possess neither the eloquence of diction, that poetry of imagination, nor that brilliance of metaphor to tell you all that they mean. But these are some of the things they are. They build your basic character. They mold you for the future role of custodians of the nation's defense. They make you strong enough to know when you are weak, and brave enough to face yourself when you are afraid. They teach you to be proud and unbending in honest failure, but humble and gentle in success. To learn to stand up in the storm, but to have compassion on those who fall. To master yourself before you seek to master others. To learn to laugh, but never be afraid to weep. End of quote. This concept of duty begins the moment a young person becomes a cadet. Plebes enter towards the end of June, usually a class of about 1,100 young people from all over the United States. They go through, as Steve said, a period of basic training called Beast Barracks. Beast Barracks is under the command of the seniors, the first class of cadets. It's a tough time. It's a whittling them from civilian life to military life in just a few short months. They're allowed to have 4 responses in all their interactions with the upper class. Yes, sir. No, sir. No excuse, sir. Sir, I do not understand. And that's pretty much it. The yearlings, who are sophomores, are involved in military training at the academy for their summer. Again, led by the seniors in first class. The junior class goes out into military posts all around the world, getting a hands-on first experience in real military life. And then the senior class, again, remains at West Point to be instructors for these younger people. From the very beginning, the West Point experience is one of being assigned responsibility. Not just in things like making your bed properly, but taking assigned tasks that impact life in the mess hall, on the athletic fields, and in the classroom. Older cadets are placed in positions of responsibility which demand more of them as they demand more of the cadets who come after them. Training in leadership begins early and increases with time. The concept of honor distinguishes the West Pointer, partly because of the honor code that says a cadet will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. The honor code makes toleration an honor offense equivalent to committing the offense. In other words, turning a blind eye to the offense is totally unacceptable. A high standard like this is very difficult for young people coming into West Point to accept, particularly since they're coming from a culture that says you don't rat on your friend. But with formal instruction on ethics and honor, the cadets seem to rise to that high standard that is to be carried into officership. Virgin and I were in Oxford, England several years ago in summer, and somebody shouted from across the street, "Hey, chaplain!" A young man came running over. I didn't recognize him as a cadet who had graduated the year before because he was a Turkish cadet. Each year, about 12 cadets come from allied countries to join the Corps of Cadets for their 4-year experience. This young man was from Turkey. We spoke about his experiences in the Turkish army as an officer. And he said, "Oh, chaplain, it's not the same. There's not the honor, there's not the integrity that I've learned as part of officership. I wish I could be in the United States Army." Part of my assignment at West Point was the realization that this was a secular academy. Her mission was unique in that she was training young leaders for the military profession, people who would be called on to fight our nation's wars. This was the starting place for young people who would actually be called on to die for their country. What was the role of faith, of belief in God, in preparing leaders of character who would lead our military, who would go to war? It became apparent to me that faith expression, religious traditions, were encouraged at the academy. Mandatory chapel had ceased the year before I got there. And yet, there was a lot of chapel attendance in all the post-chapels. Officers set the example, and there was a good climate for a person who wanted to serve God in this place, even though it was a secular college, secular academy, to serve the Lord. Reality was, however, that only 30 to 40% of cadets were involved in any kind of religious activity. 90% of those who came in as plebes indicated some religious denominational tie. But in reality, many of them didn't have any kind of formal religious expression at the academy. And so I was facing this dilemma. We say we're training young people to be leaders of character. Our motto is duty, honor, country. What place does faith have? Or how can this be done if faith is not offered to all cadets? There were the hardcore cadets who were dynamic in their faith, whether it was Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish. And then there was that great wave of people who came from good homes, where parents perhaps attended religious worship, and so these came periodically to chapel. But many cadets had no tie to religious activity. How was it then that we would deal with faith issues with all members of the Corps? It was certain that we couldn't mandate spirituality. Compulsory chapel attendance had ceased. No one could be forced to believe in God. The academy must not be in the business of telling cadets that they had to be religious. And always hanging over our heads was this idea of the separation of church and state. The government provided chaplains for West Point. Mandatory chapel had existed for 150 years. Federal funds were designated to support the religious program at the academy. If there were questions or criticism about this, that was settled in Washington. But there were other issues that we were constantly wrestling with in terms of church and state. For instance, I would go into the mess hall, and it seats 4,000 cadets for meals, and there's an elevated place called the poop deck where they are called to attention before meals. And one day a week I would give a prayer. The leading cadet would say, give your attention to the chaplain. And then it was 30 to 40 seconds. I usually took a little part of a psalm, something to acknowledge God. It wasn't a long prayer, and it would not offend Protestants, Catholics, or Jews, or anybody. One day, 3 senior cadets came into my office and said, Chaplain, we want you to stop giving prayers in the mess hall. I said, well, what's the problem? They said, well, that's a mandatory formation for us. We have to be there. And you're giving a prayer makes that a mandatory religious service. So we'd like you to stop. Well, I waited a couple months. They graduated, and the next year I started it again. It was probably 2 or 3 days later, the same thing happened. Cadets came in and said, Chaplain. And I learned later that they were discussing this in law class. So the whole senior class was aware that the chaplain wasn't really supposed to be leading prayers in the mess hall. Another experience was an outside organization always sent plebe Bibles, or beautiful leather-covered Bibles, to every new cadet with his or her name embossed in the cover. It's a beautiful tradition that goes back over 100 years. A separation of church-state organization, I think up in Wisconsin, wrote to me and said, this must be stopped. You really can't do this. You're forcing Bibles on all the cadets. So we compromised, and now the cadets can sign up for a Bible when they get there, and pretty much everybody's happy. But how is it possible to make spiritual discipline an integral part of every cadet's experience? And that's the struggle I was facing as a chaplain. You may have read this week that the Air Force Academy has provided a place now for Druid worship, for Earth worshippers, for those of the Wiccan groups. And it's defended as part of their right as a member of the service of the United States to have a place to worship. I think sometimes we push these boundaries too far, and this will be discussed, I'm sure, for a long time. The separation of church and state was something hanging over our head in the national parks. Our program brought college and seminary students into a national park where they would work in the hotels and restaurants and gift shops, and then on Sundays they would conduct Christian worship. And that's perfectly legal. It's to support the park service and their employees who can't go to church, or visitors who are at the park. But constantly, senators and congressmen are getting letters about this Christian group who are working in our national parks, where you're not supposed to have religious activity like this. Obviously, we're going to see more and more tension in this area, not only from the service academies, but from organizations that legally and legitimately work in our national places of parks and recreation. The answer for me in this spiritual struggle was a theological one. Perhaps in the end, the Federal Service Academies mandating spirituality comes down to a theological issue. Common grace versus special grace. Common grace is the attitude that all of us, all human beings, are made in the image of God. Every human being has the potential for goodness and to do incredibly good things. Special grace says that while human beings are made in the image of God, we all become self-centered by nature, some call it the fall, and we are capable of terrible things. In special grace, God reaches out, and through His Son, Jesus Christ, He changes our life, and He gives us the capacity for fellowship with Himself. Common grace, image of God, capable of good things. Special grace, God's intervention in humanity, giving us something very special to bring out the best in us with consistency. Faith in your fellow soldier, faith in your government, faith in your commander is necessary as a member of the armed forces. But faith in God cannot be required. The spirituality required in the academy mission must be common grace. The idea that the human spirit can be trained to think and perform duty, honor, country. But as a Christian, I'm not satisfied with that. We need much more than that. The United States provides chaplains for her armed services and places of worship for all military duty stations. West Point is endowed with beautiful chapels and encouraged to worship. Since 1802, when the academy was founded, there have been chaplains. Thomas Warner was chaplain in 1826, and his legacy is not so much in what he said or did, but in his family. Thomas Warner's brother was a wealthy New York businessman who went through some real trials because he lost a lot of money in a big crash, and he lost his wife. So Warner and his two daughters bought a home out in West Point in a little island called Constitution Island, a historic piece of land right off of Trophy Point. One house. And his daughters spent most of their lives there. They were prolific authors, but they were also dynamic Christians. And they came to the academy, they taught Sunday school, they taught Bible studies, and then fortunate cadets could come over to their island home where they would also lead Bible studies. The legacy that they have left is in songs and books. Anna Warner wrote a little poem that goes like this. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Her older sister Anna wrote a Sunday school song that I still sing in my quiet office, and I quote many times in prayer. Jesus bids us shine with a clear, pure light, like a little candle burning in the night. In this world of darkness, we must shine. You in your small corner, and I in mine. They were angels of special grace at West Point. In addition to leading worship at the chapels, the chaplain was called on to perform what we call traditional duties. Marrying, burying, giving prayers at ceremonies. In fact, when I got to West Point, my predecessor said, Dick, always carry an invocation in this pocket, a benediction in this pocket, and remarks in your back pocket. Two experiences I had in formal duties. The Army-Navy game is held in Philadelphia most of the time, and an invocation is offered in the stadium by the Academy chaplain. My game day usually begins by having a service with the football team early Saturday morning. Now it's Saturday, Steve. And then changing into a suit, going to the stadium, giving a prayer before the game, and then running into the locker room, putting on my chain gang uniform, and I worked the sidelines as a linesman. If visibility is an asset, I was golden. One of the most memorable experiences was in 1981. 52 Americans were held hostage in Iran for 444 days. Upon their release, it was determined that West Point would be the place where they would be reunited with their families. The ambiance, the ability for security was what they wanted. The superintendent asked me to prepare a service of reunion on that Sunday afternoon for the returnees and their families and his guests and other VIPs. I selected Psalm 46 for the text. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. And I think I got their attention in my opening statement when I said today would happen to be Super Bowl Sunday. I said today, the most important touchdown in the world was not in the Super Bowl. It was at Stewart Airport when your plane landed back home in the United States. The cadet prayer for decades has been a model for cadets, a guide to moral and spiritual nurture. And it was read every Sunday at the cadet chapel, and I think at many of the other chapels. It was written by one of my predecessors back in 1926. It speaks about the unique character that's required of members of the Long Gray Line. And I'm sure there are West Pointers here, or parents of West Pointers, who could probably quote parts of that prayer because it's been so deeply etched in their mind and experience. Things like, help us to choose the harder right instead of the easier wrong, and never to be content with a half-truth when the whole can be won. The Academy focuses on what they call 6 developmental domains, 6 areas to make a complete person. The military, the academic, the physical, the spiritual, the ethical, and the social. Focusing on these things to make the leader of character. I think we might well think about this ourselves, regardless of what state of life you're in. The academic, you're not too old to read, to think, to memorize, to learn. We've got to keep our mind active. This physical, we've got to be in shape, eat right, try to do our exercise, to be healthy. The spiritual, work at our relationship with God. Maintain that vitality that grows instead of gets old and stale. The ethical, thinking about what's right and wrong, not just for you, but for our nation and for our communities. And then the social. Do I get along with my neighbors? Do I relate to my neighbors? How is my social dimension? You look at a cadet's day, you look at a 4-year program of Corps Cadets, and you see these things being implemented. You and I do not have that disciplinary environment, but we desperately need the balance that these things can give. So please consider that. Don't take it lightly. Worship in the summer with incoming cadets, the new class, was outdoors. We met on the trophy point that Steve alluded to. A beautiful overlook, looking up the Hudson River Valley with the mountains rising out of the valley. What a spot for worship. What a backdrop to point to God. And every Sunday, I would call them to worship with words that echoed up the Hudson River Valley all the way to the mountains of Afghanistan. Lift up your eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. Worship during the academic year was in several different chapels. We had a lot of freedom to do it. Steve alluded to the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, which was one of my favorite projects. We had probably 300 athletes involved in this, and our theme was to build spiritual muscle. All cadets had to be strong physically. They had to work out, they had to pay the price to be fit. Our relationship to God is like a muscle. It's got to be exercised, it's got to be used. Our theme verse was from 2 Timothy that said, exercise yourself spiritually. Physical fitness has some value, but godliness is valuable in everything. It has benefit in this life and also the life which is to come. Cadets got the idea. You can't run a marathon by being a couch potato. And you can't be a strong man or woman of character. You can't be a strong man or woman of God without exercising the spiritual muscle. Muscles like faith, prayer, selfless service. This all takes exercise, and it takes exercise on a daily basis. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Abolition of Man, made an awesome statement when he said, the mere knowledge of right and wrong is powerless against men's appetites. Reason must rule the appetite by means of the spirited element. And that spirited element I call spiritual muscle, that we exercise when no one else is watching or when half the world is watching, for that matter. Spiritual muscle. And that's true for cadets, it's true for each one of us. don't neglect your spiritual muscle. While the concept of spirituality was in support of the Academy mission, personal faith remained voluntary. Common grace is alive and well, and I'm grateful for that. Beyond the Christian community, the chaplain had freedom to hang out with the cadets. At least I did as a civilian, and that was ball. I could play touch football with the cadets on the plane. Officers couldn't do that. I coached the Army lightweight team before I became the senior chaplain, and had opportunity to, we call it contact work, and this was a terrific experience for me. I could quarterback better than most of the cadets anyway in touch football, so gained a little reputation there. But it did lead to a lot of questions, a lot of observations, a lot of wedding counseling and wedding ceremonies that otherwise may not have taken place. Our home life was also a part of our ministry. Cadets were entertained, cadets became part of our home and family, and not just in the chaplain's home, where perhaps they would have a prayer before a meal and a discussion about Jesus' attitude towards war and peace. This was done in hundreds of officer homes across the academy. The officers played a very critical role in building leaders of character. These were men and women who were warriors. They had served in the Army. They were regular Army. They came to West Point for a 3-year tour to teach, and then they'd go back to their units. They were role models as warriors. Cadets would go into their homes by invitation and see what a military family looked like and lived like. And they would be free to, in a relaxed atmosphere, to ask questions. So the same was true of the chaplain's family. And I know that there are families here tonight whose cadet sons became part of our extended family. And the ripple effect continues, both in business and in the military across the world. In closing, I'd like to speak about peacemakers. Who are the real peacemakers? Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." St. Augustine said, "Even in waging war, cherish the spirit of a peacemaker. Let necessity, therefore, and not your own will, slay the enemy who fights against you. As violence is used toward him who rebels and resists, so mercy is due the vanquished and the captive." End of quote. Cadets at West Point are trained to be warriors, leaders of character, and in the best sense, peacemakers. Our mission is meeting and defeating our enemy. But before meeting and defeating our enemy, our strategy will depend on deterrence. Better to protect our country with strength that deters our enemy than to actually go to war. Remember that the purpose of the state is to preserve order, to resist and restrain evil, and to do justice. When we speak of the warrior and the peacemaker, we must understand the sacrifice that women and men make in our military services. Separation becomes a way of life for our families, for our troops. My son-in-law is a Navy veteran who flies for Delta. He flies international, so he's away 3, 4, 5 days at a time. His wife has to shuttle the 3 kids to school, shuttle them to soccer and basketball, help them with the homework at night, plus all her home duties. It's tough without Dad's help. Now think about the service members who say goodbye, not just for 3 to 4 days, but for 6 months, or for a year, or for more. And then when they return, these warriors may never be the same. Some return as wounded warriors, like my friend Greg Gedson. Greg was an Army football player, played linebacker for us in the late 80s. As a lieutenant colonel, he was in Afghanistan, and a landmine seriously injured him so much so that he had to have both legs amputated above the knee. Greg had a great attitude. He came home. He continued to love his troops. He continued to want to stay in the Army. Talk about sacrifice. We don't understand it. Selfless service. It's written all over these young people who go in harm's way because they represent their country, because they try to do those things to preserve our values and our freedom. Greg's heroic attitude became quite well known in 2007. A teammate was assistant coach of the New York Giants and asked Greg to come before one of the games to talk to the team. The Giants had had a lousy start. Greg talked to them about camaraderie, teamwork, sacrifice. The team responded. They were fired up and they won game after game after game. When they played for the divisional title up in Green Bay, a lieutenant colonel in a wheelchair was wheeled out to be the honorary captain for the New York Giants. And after they won the Super Bowl, Greg got a Super Bowl ring. General MacArthur sounded like a theologian when he spoke about sacrifice. The old soldier left these profound words with the Corps of Cadets. Quote, "The soldier, above all men, is required to practice the greatest act of religious training, sacrifice. In battle and in the face of danger and death, he discloses those divine attributes which his Maker gives when he created man in his own image. No physical courage and no brute instinct can take the place of the divine help which alone can sustain him. However horrible the incidents of war may be, the soldier who is called upon to offer and to give his life for his country is the noblest development of mankind." Concluding his speech that day at West Point, General MacArthur said this: "The long gray line has never failed us. Were you to do so, a million ghosts in olive drab, in brown khaki, in blue and gray would rise from their white crosses, thundering those magic words: duty, honor, country. This does not mean that you are warmongers. On the contrary, the soldier, above all other people, prays for peace. For he must suffer and bear the deepest wounds and scars of war. But always in our ears rings the ominous words of Plato, that wisest of all philosophers: only the dead have seen the end of war." End of quote. End of my comment.